and welcome to the 18th broadcast of the Nerdlfix podcast. Today, we have a very interesting episode ahead of us, and because today's topic is the Dark Crystal. So let's get started. Hey, it's time for Nerdlfix!
Welcome to the Nerdlfix podcast.
The Dark Crystal is a very good film and one of my personal favorites. I do very much so enjoy The Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal came back in 1982 and was a film featuring a lot of Jim Henson's puppets. But not like fun Muppets. These were like really detailed creatures. And it was a very interesting story, though when I first watched it, I didn't follow the plot very well and I got a little confused, but now rewatching it a couple times, I pretty much get it. It's a pretty good film. The plot, after watching it once or twice, then you can easily follow the plot. It's just a little bit confusing at first. So it is a pretty complex film and it's nothing like Jim Henson had done before. The plot is pretty complicated, so I'm not really going to go super into detail. If you are interested and you haven't seen it, I recommend looking it up on like Wikipedia or anything like that. But the plot, like I said, is kind of complicated. So basically the overview, there's this guy, he's a Gethling, which is another magical creature, named Jen, and he goes through all these crazy adventures trying to find shards of the Dark Crystal, and all sorts of stuff happens. There's this other Gelfling named Kira, and then more action happens. There's these thing called the Skeksis, which are really creeping bird reptile things. Of course, they're against them. They do some fighting. There's a huge plot line. It's really complicated. It's kind of hard to explain. If you're interested, look it up or watch the movie. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a Jim Henson film. It's nothing like anything he had done in the past, like The Muppets and Sesame Street. It's darker and more complex, and nothing like he had ever done. He actually came up with the idea for this film when he was trapped in a hotel because of a snowstorm. He came up with the general outline for the film, and that's how the film was created. Like I mentioned, this film was a lot more scarier and darker and more complex than anything Jim Henson had done before. And it was more scary and darker and complex for a children's film, really, even though it is kind of meant for children. And this movie actually started a trend of movies that were more scary films but still meant for children, such as movies like Return to Oz. That is the sequel to The Wizard of Oz. In my opinion, it's not a very good movie. I watched it. It's kind of cheesy. It's really confusing, but, if you have Disney Plus and you want to check that out, it is kind of fun to watch. The Never-Ending Story, a very good movie. The Witches, based on Roald Dahl's book, The Witches. And The Monster Squad, one of my personal favorite films of all time. So The Dark Crystal actually inspired and started up all these movies. When they first showed this movie to preview audiences, they didn't like it. They just straight up didn't like the film. They thought it was confusing. They thought certain characters were hard to understand. So in the end, they did new voices over characters you couldn't understand. I don't think they changed the film any much after that, though. But at first, they did not like the movie. Of course, before the movie, there had been plenty of films to feature puppets in a movie. Of course, before this, there had already been a featured-length Muppets movie. But this is the first movie to not feature any human actors and only feature puppets. Because even the Muppets movie still had some human actors, but this movie only has puppets in it, and it is the first film to only have puppets. One character I mentioned in the film are called the Skeksis. These are kind of the villain of the film. I want to say kind of. I'm pretty sure they are the villain of the film. And they look really weird. They look kind of repulsive and horrifying, actually. And the creator describes them as, very perfectly describes them, as part reptile, part bird, and part dragon. And like I said, I think that is a perfect representation of how they look in the film. Not only were the Skeksis repulsive, horrifying characters, they were also very complex. All the puppets in the film are very, very detailed and complex, and that's one thing I really do love about the movie. But especially the Skeksis. Not just their faces, but their entire outfits. In fact, a Skeksis costume took over about 300 feet of fabric per Skeksis, and there were like 7 of them. So that is a lot of fabric. And now it is time for another segment of Product Review. Today, of course, we will be talking about the products of the Dark Crystal. Now, at first glance, there are not that many out there. If you go to your regular sites such as Amazon, there's really not much. Here on Amazon, they have, of course, t-shirts. There's really always t-shirts available. Some pretty cool t-shirts, too. A 500-piece puzzle for pretty cheap, actually about $9. You could get a guidebook to all the creatures. That would be pretty cool, actually. You can get a 2021 Dark Crystal calendar. And, of course, you can get all sorts of other t-shirts, including one with Fizzgig on it, my favorite character from the Dark Crystal. If you do not know who that is like this little fluff ball that Kira carries around throughout the entire film. It's basically just like her pet. And for only $240, yeah, I know that's a lot, you can get a Fizzgig puppet. That would be amazing to own, but I don't think I have that kind of money. I don't even think it would really be worth it. That is a lot of money. But that's it for Amazon. Really not much. The Dark Crystal does have an official website, but they don't sell any merchandise. They do have some pretty cool Zoom backgrounds you can download. They're pretty cool. So if you're into that, I recommend checking it out. Darkcrystal.com. That's it, but they don't seem to sell merchandise, though. If you're a fan, though, you still want to check it out, I'd say. But if you do dig a little bit further to some of the more uncommon websites, such as entertainmentearth.com, they do have a good bit of Dark Crystal collectibles and merchandise. They have the Dark Crystal puzzle, the same one Amazon had. This one's just a little bit more expensive. They have all sorts of collectible figures. They have a Dark Crystal pin. They have a Dark Crystal retro tin lunchbox. And of course, they have the Dark Crystal Funko Pops for a reasonable $11. That's the usual Dark Crystal price. You can get a Dark Crystal necklace with a crystal shard on it. So there is some pretty cool stuff out there if you just look a little bit deeper. Now, since everything in this movie were puppets, of course there had to be puppeteers. And since these puppets were really complicated, they were really complicated to control, and they were also pretty large. So it actually took 6 people to control one Skeksis. And again, I'm pretty sure there were 7 Skeksis. So that's like a lot of people. So it took 6 per Skeksis. And it took 2 in the costume itself, and then 4 underneath a built-in platform controlling the rest of the puppet. In fact, they needed built-in monitors just to see what was going on around them to control the puppet. It was pretty complicated. After seeing how detailed and complex these puppets were in this film, George Lucas sought out Jim Henson to make him a Yoda puppet for Empire Strikes Back. And in the end, Yoda was actually made by the same team that created the puppets for the Dark Crystal. This movie was made up of 75 different sets. 75! That is a lot of sets. And each one had to be 4 feet above the ground to make room for all the puppeteers to get under and control the puppets. So that's 75 sets that had to be raised 4 feet above the ground. Later into the film, we meet these things called the Garthams, which are basically like giant beetles, and they are working for the Skeksis, so they are against Jen and Kira. And these costumes and puppets were incredibly heavy. In fact, the performers who were inside of the costume had to hang the costume on a rack with them inside of it just for them to get rest inside the costume because it was so heavy.
Oh, this is heavy, Doc.
They tried to get this movie a sequel, but not until 2006. In fact, one of the people involved with one of the shows, The Clone Wars, a very good show if you are a Star Wars fan, by the way, he tried to get this movie a sequel, again back in 2006. But the movie never made it up off the ground, so they took the script and they actually made it into 12 comic book issues called The Power of the Dark Crystal. So check that out in case you're interested in a Dark Crystal sequel. In this very episode of the Nerdlfix podcast, Nerdlfix number 18, we will be starting a very new segment called Forgotten Facts. These are all facts that I didn't feature or learned after the episode of a different subject. So all the facts would be of a different subject from a past episode, such as Jurassic Park, Gremlins, Spider-Man, Star Wars, A New Hope. All sorts of stuff like that I've covered in the past. These are all facts I didn't use, facts I learned after doing the podcast, facts I had forgotten I knew, and all sorts of stuff like that. So we'll start off this segment, the very first Forgotten Facts segment, with a fact about Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. In the scene in which they are pod racing, they have the big pod race on Tatooine, you can see these huge stands full of tons of people. And not all of this was CGI. In fact, they created a scale model set to film wide shots of the stands. But how do you get all those little people in there, and how do you make it look like they're moving? Well, the set designer took Q-tips and painted them all individually different colors, and then put them through this mesh that was lined in the bleachers or the stands of the pod race. And then from below the set, they blew fans to make the Q-tips jiggle around slightly, which made it look like fans in the stands moving around. Alright guys, that is it for this episode of the Nerdlfix podcast. I hope you liked the new segment I introduced. I'm trying to make that a permanent thing. I'll try and do that in more episodes. And join us next week when we cover the Ghostbusters movie, and we cover the new movie that's coming out June 11th. So that is not this Friday, but next Friday. So next week we'll be doing a Ghostbusters episode to celebrate that. And until then, I will see you next week on Nerdlfix.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.